Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in today for Kirby Anderson, and we have got a great show for you. In the first hour, we're going to be talking about the growing presence and influence of the Hispanic community in the conservative movement and in the Republican Party. And then for the second hour, we're going to turn to the tax issue. You know, President Biden wants to raise a number of taxes in order to be able to pass and pay for his $3.5 trillion spending spree. And so we're going to have Dan Pilla, a longtime friend of Point of View and a longtime friend of me, to discuss some of these taxes that they're looking at putting in the new bill. But let's first now turn to the issue of the growing presence and influence of Hispanics in the conservative movement. Joining me in studio is Edward Retta. Edward is a longtime friend. He has a consulting company where he does cross-cultural consulting. He is also a graduate of Texas A&M University, Dallas Theological Seminary, and you studied at Oxford University, I think, for a little while.
The one in England.
The one in England. I've actually been there, but that was just passing through, and I got a T-shirt there. He's on the board of directors of the Hispanic Leadership Alliance and the Hispanic Republicans of Texas, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Also joining me on the phone is a lady I've been hoping to get on for some time, Adrienne Peña. She is a political activist and in the movement, and she is serving as the chairwoman of the Hidalgo County, Texas Republican Party. Adrienne, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
We've been wanting to have you on because you have become, as they say, a rock star, both among Republicans and in Texas. Now, you're in Hidalgo County. I actually lived there one time. There's McAllen down there. I lived in Weslaco for a year back when I was quite young. But you're along the southern border of Texas, and that has a heavy Hispanic population, long been a sort of a Democratic stronghold, but that's changing, and it shocked a number of people back in 2020 in the election when several of those counties went Republican. Tell us about that.
Well, first, let me just say, as I was born in Weslaco, so small world. I was raised in Edinburgh, and I think that, it's a sign of the time. The turnout was just a reflection of time and resources invested in the area. And I also, we get involved with the grassroots. We're somewhat cheerleaders for these statewide, and we have this belief that they're going to come and save us. And at some point, in the past decade, you realize, you know what, I'm the superhero that we need. We've got to, pick up our boots by the bootstraps and figure out, okay, maybe we don't have all the resources in the world, but what do we have? And there's a lot of talent, untapped talent in the Valley. There's a lot of diversity within the Republican Party. But what we do also have is that we've lost so many times. We keep running, we keep giving our all, we keep growing, but we've also kept losing. And so what happens is whether you're a libertarian or a traditional conservative or, Hispanic Republican or, maybe you don't affiliate with much party, but you want balance. There's more and more people getting involved that are tired of losing. They're tired of, a lot of these elected officials that don't really invest in the grassroots. And I think that I'm not alone in the state by saying is that there's this disconnect with leadership and grassroots. And, there's a lot of interest and fundraising and donors, but I feel, especially here in South Texas, Hidalgo County, is that it's very little to do with empowering the grassroots and encouraging individual freedom. Yes, historically, we've always voted Democrat, but that was over 100 years. And what has that gotten us? And so, competition is a healthy thing. Yeah. And we want more competition. And we have office hours that are open. And so people will come in. And a lot of the times, and Monica de la Cruz Hernandez and Myra Flores are a perfect example of this, is they have this talent and sometimes we need someone else to tell us, hey, you've got that something. Adrienne, you should continue, train, become more informed on what's going on, because there's something about you that I think we need to see. And that's what's happening. And now they also have opponents in the primary that have amazing resumes as well. But both Monica and Myra have invested a lot of sweat equity in the grassroots here for the past, 2 years. But the past 4 years since I became chair, it's just frustration of knowing that the area is conservative, knowing that we have a lot to offer, whether it's trade. There's a lot of young professionals that have aspirations. They come get educated here and then they leave. And, knocking on doors and phone banking is something that Republicans historically have not invested much in down here. But if we knock on their doors and we share the message and we show them the difference of the, political spectrum, I think many, many, many more will be voting Republican. And those numbers would have been so much larger if we would have invested just a little bit more.
Edward, Adrienne is talking about what's happening there in Hidalgo, but she also mentioned that this is broader statewide. So this isn't just a phenomenon in the southern tip of Texas. This is true across the state, isn't it?
Right. This is happening not just in Texas. Of course, the big story has been South Texas in the last year, and what Adrienne and a lot of her colleagues down there are doing. But, if we're looking statewide and if we're looking even nationally, there's actually an identifiable trend of more Hispanic voters flipping from Democratic to the Republican Party. That is happening, and it's demonstrated not only in South Texas. Let me just give you one example we were talking about earlier before we went on the air. The recent recall election in California.
Yes.
All right. California, deep blue, left coast, left-wing California. In that election, even though it went, not our way, 2-1, reflecting kind of the demographic. There's twice as many Democrats in California as Republican voters. If you look at the Hispanic vote for that one election, there was a 10% migration away from the Democrats and to the Republicans. So Hispanic voters who voted in that recall election voted 10% more against Gavin Newsom than they had previously voted for Democrats.
And Adrienne is just on the cover of Texas Monthly. I think you've got a copy of that, don't you?
Yeah, I can hold it up so we can see it on the radio.
They can those live streaming can see this, but this is the October issue, I think, of Texas Monthly, as it highlights some of the changes that are going and raises some questions out there. Because Adrienne, it says this is something of a non sequitur. This isn't what people were expecting to see, and yet it's beginning to happen. And I'll tell you, I have for years had people, and you know this, Adrienne, from Texas, people have said, well, the state is growing, the minority population is growing here. Texas may be conservative now, but the day is coming when it's going to flip to become Democrats, and Democrats have been hoping for that for some time. And I would always respond, maybe, but the Hispanic population has been growing in Texas for decades, and it seems to me that the state's getting more conservative and not less conservative. So, Adrienne, stay with us. When we come back, I want you to talk about a little bit about what's happening down there and why you think that's happening. We're talking about the growing influence of Hispanics in the conservative movement and among Republicans. So stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Karine Hajar asked an important question. Do universities still care about truth? I suspect you already know the answer, but her commentary surfaced some interesting facts. She is a recent graduate of Harvard and even served on the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson. Although universities say they value diversity, intellectual diversity is not something they seem to value. She reminds us that only 3% of Harvard University's faculty reported being conservative. Organizations that work on college campuses have found that most faculty and students are self-censoring themselves on campus. They have seen what happens to anyone who strays from leftist orthodoxy. College and cancel culture, she says, has become disturbingly synonymous. To illustrate her point, she tells the story of Professor Steven Pinker. In previous commentaries, I've talked about some of his books, including Enlightenment Now. He has persuasively argued that the world isn't getting worse, but improving in significant ways. Apparently, that's what got him in trouble. Hundreds of members of the Linguistic Society of America have signed a petition to remove him from the organization. The complaint comes from an African-American social scientist who believes that reporting that overt racism is decreasing is legitimate grounds for punishment. Now, Pinker is a big enough name to weather the latest political storm. Of course, he also has tenure. But other educators and students are not as fortunate. As one attorney put it, if you have to be Steven Pinker to avoid being canceled, that's a problem. This latest example illustrates what happens to a secular progressive Ivy League professor. Other faculty members and students really don't stand much of a chance. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and with me in studio is Edward Retta. He is on the board of the Hispanic Leadership Alliance and the Hispanic Republicans of Texas, and joining us by phone is Adrienne Peña. She is the chairwoman of the Hidalgo County Republican Party. And, you know, we've had this issue with immigration. It has been a big topic the last few weeks. It is toned down a little bit now, but it may be coming back. I hear more people are moving. Edward, what's this immigration issue that this hits southern Texas?
It does, and I'm going to go to Adrienne here in just a second, but just to frame this, I think conservatives were aware of the border crisis. We're aware of the massive influx of undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants, since President Biden took office. I'm not sure that the mainstream media covers it. I don't think they do, but I know as conservatives we're aware of this. So let me just frame it like this. Interestingly, immigration is occasionally a big topic, but when we look at data, at surveys, at reputable studies of Hispanic voters, and then that's a subset of all Hispanics in the country, okay? Because we do have many undocumented, not a majority certainly. 2/3 of us are actually U.S. citizens. But when we ask the population in general, and then we break them down between legal residents, registered voters, immigration is actually not a top-line topic of interest, certainly not for the Hispanic voter. Now, again, that's looking nationally. So I'm going to defer to Adrienne here locally. Adrienne, tell us, in your part of Texas, what's the story down there? Because I penned an article last year about the election, and one of my statements was, it's remarkable that in South Texas, where the detention centers are, where people live on the border, that the Republican Party had the successes it did. So let's go to Adrienne again.
Adrienne?
So, Hispanics on the border, Texans on the border, we support law and order. And we want to put our family first, and we want to put God first. And we respect, family values, and we support the Back to Blue. And so what we started to do at the Hidalgo County GOP is we would have community engagement events. So we have a law enforcement committee, and we have events open up to the public. And we just encourage, people to come see and learn more about us. And our committee, we love this region. We love our county. But there is a proper way to do things, and there's legal immigration and illegal immigration. And more and more people, if you spread the message and you let people know what it is that we stand for, I believe we're going to remove the stain that, unfortunately, the Republican brand had here on the border. And people are standing up, and we've been bullied. I've been bullied horrifically, and that's starting to stop because we are standing up. We're threatening to sue, threatening to hold elected officials accountable. And social media has been a huge advocate and helpful in our movement. But the Grand Old Party is now the growth, opportunity, and prosperity movement.
Interesting. So, Adrienne, there's a narrative out there that if you are concerned about undocumented workers coming across, if you're concerned about illegal immigration, people slipping in and spreading throughout the country, that's going to hurt a party's voter rating. I mean, people are going to be opposed to that because there's so many who are supportive of it. But you're down there, and what you're telling us is that the Hispanic community supports legal immigration. I do too, but is concerned about undocumented workers coming across illegally. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, no, and it's okay for Hispanics to say, you know what, the asylum seeking is being abused. And we can't expect to come to the table and talk about compromission, immigration reform if we have just this abuse. It's blatant abuse that's happening on our southern border, and Hispanics that live here see it. I mean, when the illegals that came across, they were going to hold them very close to our headquarters, the ones that tested positive for COVID. And several members of the community rose up and walked over there and said, hey, not here. This is a church community. This is an educational school zone. And people would drive by speaking Spanish saying, what are they doing here? Please have them leave. We don't want them here in this community because it's not sustainable. It's not safe. And that's what we support. I mean, we want, the Republican Party is the party for Hispanics. And I think more and more of them are realizing that, the keeping of your guns, pro-life, oil independence, jobs, supporting law enforcement, against the cancel culture and the gun control and the pro-radical abortion support and the Hollywood getting involved with the Democratic Party. Individuals like myself are standing up and saying, no, I don't want that for my family.
Edward, there was a narrative also during the campaign that that Donald Trump is anti-immigrant and that's going to hurt his numbers. But when Joe Biden gets in, his poll numbers we're going to see higher poll numbers for Joe Biden with Hispanics because he has done such a good job and he's very welcoming to immigrants. But the poll numbers for Joe Biden and Hispanics have been tanking, have they? Along with all other poll numbers.
They certainly have been. I mean, any listener, all you have to do is go on a search engine and put in Biden approval rating in Hispanics, and you will see instance after instance. I'm looking at a Quinnipiac poll here. 69% of Hispanics disapprove of Biden's handling of immigration. Only 23% approve. And there are numerous polls out there like this. And it's not just on immigration, but many, many other issues. I think something would be helpful to discuss is this trend of Hispanics voting more conservative, being part of the conservative movement, voting Republican. I'd like to ask Adrienne, and then I'll weigh in on why, because I think it's important for listeners and concerned citizens, concerned Americans across the country. Why is this happening? So I'd like to hear that from Adrienne, and then I'll weigh in. Why is this happening, Adrienne?
I'm sorry. Somebody walked into our headquarters and I lost the question. Can you please repeat it?
Why are Hispanics trending more conservative and Republican, broadly?
Well, because of our traditional values. I mean, mom and dad and grandparents, they raised us. They raised us to teach family values to our kids and, to honor God first. And, if you work hard, you should be able to keep that money. And if you want to give back to the community, it should be on your own merit. And less government, I think, is something that the Hispanic community understands.
And Adrienne, but the Hispanics have had conservative values for some time, and that's been one of the questions that have puzzled some of us is Hispanics are conservative. Why are they voting Democratic? Now, it may be that you could say that the Democratic Party has just changed over the years. They left you behind because they are no longer the conservative party. There's not really any conservatives, or even you can make the case that there's some moderates in there someplace, but not many. But what happened if you've been conservative for some time, why are Hispanics just now changing?
Oh, well, they weren't hearing this side of the story. Locally, unfortunately, in the past, you'll hear just the left side, and you won't really get to pick objectively by hearing both sides. And so it's sort of just been forced down our throats. But then nationally, the defund the police and the worry of losing jobs and higher gas rates, I mean, they're starting to affect families. And when you invest in the GOP, and that's what we've been doing on the border, is social media has been a big help of us, but we grow our team. And our team gets to spread those messages within their communities and their neighborhoods. And so I think there needs to be more investment in areas, not just on the border, but, blue areas, purple areas that maybe Republicans have kind of forgotten or put to the side. I think that if we can identify candidates, grow a team, and highlight them, it's not always about highlighting the politician or myself. It's about highlighting the grassroots and their individual gifts and talents, God-given talents.
Adrienne, you're in the valley there, and I used to live there. You need work. It's an agricultural area. There's a lot of picking that has to go on, and we need workers who are able to do that. And I'm wondering if you've given some thought to how the whole immigration reform is such a mess in the country right now. It is so divided, and it's been so twisted, I think, in many ways. It's just going to be hard to get immigration reform. But we do need workers who can come across and work and be able to do things and maybe go back home and other things. When we come back from the break, I'd like you to express your thoughts a little bit about how we address this problem, because we need, and these days we actually need more workers than ever. We're having a real problem with the workforce in the country, but there in the valley, workers came across all the time to pick fruit and do other things, and it worked fairly well when I was living there. So I'd like to get your thoughts about that when we come back. We're talking with Adrienne Peña. She is the GOP chair of the Hidalgo County Republican Party, and with me also Edward Retta in studio. We'll be back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we're talking with Adrienne Peña. She is the chairwoman of the Hidalgo County Republican Party. And in studio with me is Edward Retta, who is on the board of the Hispanic Leadership Alliance and the Hispanic Republicans of Texas. So, Adrienne, have you got any thoughts about what... I understand that among Hispanics who are here as citizens, immigration is not a big issue for them. That's not one of their top issues. But we do have this issue of being able to we need labor in here in the country to be able to do certain things. And the Hispanic community has oftentimes been able to come up and do that. Have you given any thoughts to that?
Okay, just really quick before I begin to respond to your question, I just want to say my name's Adrienne Peña-Garza. I don't want to leave my husband's name out, but thank you very much. My grandfather and my father probably are in the background smiling. But, to answer your question, what we should do is allow our neighbors to shop and work here with identification, of course, background checks, that's fine, but address the problem, which is the abuse of asylum seekers, and we need to secure the border. And I had a conversation earlier with TLCs that I think that's very, very important, is that if we want to talk about, the problem that we have right now within the workforce or solving the immigration finding solutions to immigration, that we should first address the problem. And that's the abuse of asylum seeking and the fact that our border is extremely porous. But on the other flip side, neighbors in Mexico or, in other parts of the world that are used to coming across to work or to shop are not allowed. And I can't understand why people are just not so upset about that. It's a problem that needs to be addressed. I don't think anything's going to happen until it's fixed.
Are you seeing labor shortages down there in Hidalgo County?
Sure, and I'm sure it's seen nationwide. It is a problem, though, that it doesn't make any sense that neighbors that are used to coming over here to shop and work aren't allowed, but yet, you can come the illegal way and abuse the asylum-seeking process and, put our border in danger. It contradicts the two, and I think it's one of the reasons why we haven't solved the immigration crisis.
Thanks, buddy. I think on immigration, as you said, a lot of research indicates it's not a primary issue for Hispanic voters, right?
Right.
Nonetheless, the issue is one that, as a country, we need to resolve. Now, I've done advocacy lobbying, if you will, in D.C. for immigration reform. My personal perspective, and it's just Edward Retta's opinion, is that both parties in Washington are reluctant to solve the problem. I think the Democrats genuinely do not want to solve the immigration problem because they use it as a wedge issue every 2 years. They use it to smear Republicans as racist. We've heard this time and again. The issues Adrienne's speaking to about our economy, about security, about safety, about the need for labor, these are all real issues. But ultimately, the buck stops in Congress, and I've just seen great reluctance to move that ball forward, frankly, on both sides of the aisle.
Adrienne, another thing I've seen among this is the heavy presence of women, Hispanic women, who are involved in politics now. I mean, when you get together a panel or other things, it's oftentimes either run by women or several women on there, much more than I would say just in the sort of the normal culture. Why are women getting so engaged in this?
Well, I think that their voice is very important. And for, generations, we've had women in the passenger seat and quiet and not really having a seat at the table. And I think more and more moms and wives and sisters and relatives are speaking up because they're also affected. They're also small business owners. They're also Border Patrol agents. They're also wives. They're also law enforcement officers. They're tax-paying citizens as well. And I think that women have this ability, very compassionate. They're able to connect with people. And so I think we're going to continue to see more and more women in the Republican Party coming out of the woodwork to run for office.
And talk just a minute about the diversity of Hispanics, because we tend to say we tend to use that word like we do blacks. Blacks are different than Hispanics. I mean, you could be from Cuba, you could be from South America, you could be from Mexico. You could have been here for 5 generations and have a Hispanic name. I've got on my wife's side, there are Hispanic names, somebody from who came up from South America and married in, and you've got people who look very Anglo, but they have a Hispanic last name. It is a wide population, and yet the media tend to want to paint you as sort of a solitary group.
Right. No, people ask me, like, who are the people that you look up to? And I say Selena, the singer, and then I also say Chuck Norris. So I think it has a lot to do with, individual personality. But, of course, you have first generation, second generation, third generation. I think that also may play a factor. But also some of the first generations know exactly what it's like that are fleeing Cuba, that are fleeing some of these socialist countries. So they know firsthand where America can head and where it is heading if we don't do something about it.
I'm glad, Adrienne, that you mentioned generations, because I think this is a big factor. I'm going to, Dr. Mathis, I'm going to revisit the question of why for just a moment, since she mentioned generations. So what we know, what we know from research is that the immigrant generations, what we would call first-generation immigrants, and by the way, this isn't just Hispanic or Latino immigrants. This is pretty much across the board. People who come here, who want to come here, who leave their country, leave their home, leave their family, migrate to the U.S., consistently have polled conservative. What happens over time, the next generation becomes more liberal, more leftist, more democratic, and by the third generation, they reflect American society. Now, interestingly, among Hispanics, those who have higher educations and higher income, both of those, vote in similar patterns to white Americans. So what happens by generations is people become Americanized. This is also interestingly reflected in the crime statistics. Believe it or not, there's a lot of research that shows the first generation immigrants, the ones that came here from another country, have the lowest crime rates. Their children that are born here have higher crime rates. Their grandchildren who were born here, who never knew anything about the home country, never lived there, have crime rates that match the general American population. So it's true in voting. It's true when it comes to crime. But going to this issue of why are more Hispanics now? Why do you have me and Adrienne on the radio today? Because Hispanics are voting more Republican. Because Hispanics are becoming more conservative. I'm gonna suggest, and I want your listeners to go away with this, that it's important to understand why, right? And I think, this is my theory, that what's happened now, especially during the current administration with Joe Biden and his team, and with what happened last year in the country, with the riots last summer, with defunding the police, I think Latino voters, Hispanic residents of the U.S., are seeing what Democratic policies and politics stand for. I believe that Democratic policies and priorities are being unmasked, and Hispanics and Latinos are more than ever aware of things, and these are scary things. As Adrienne said, our values are much more conservative.
Adrienne, there's been this long-time notion that among Republicans, they tend not to spend much time trying to appeal to the black community because blacks are going to vote Democratic. That's changed some. But do you see some of that same sense going on with regards to Hispanics? Or are the Republicans beginning to say, there's something happening here, we need to embrace this and make sure we put them out front?
Well, I think they paid attention to Congressional District 15 and how Monica de la Cruz Hernandez lost by 3 percentage points. And that was basically with little to no resources. And so I think that they're realizing that if they invest a little bit more time, they're seeing that we support law and order on the border, and they're seeing that we support conservative values. I think there was maybe a trust factor. I'm not 100% sure on that. But I do know that for a fact, if you invest some time and resources in the community, there will be more and more Republicans in Texas.
You know, there's a push to try to get Beto O'Rourke to run for governor in Texas because he has a Hispanic connection. Do you see that having much effect? We've got about 40 seconds left on this segment.
So I think people in the Valley, for the most part, do see through what Beto Francis O'Rourke is trying to do. But just so you know, at the polling locations, he did show up here in McAllen. Mm-hmm. And so Democrats, what they do is they stick together and they are investing in this area. And I think it's a wake-up call for Republicans to invest the same time and resources. We can do this on our own, but it would be great if we can get the help.
My guest for this hour is Adrienne Peña-Garza, I believe it is. I got that in. And Edward Retta's in studio. And when we come back, we're going to wrap up our final segment with him to find out where the Hispanic movement goes within the Republican Party. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we're back for our final segment with Adrienne Peña-Garza, who is the chairwoman of the Hidalgo County Republican Party, and in studio with me, Edward Retta. And Edward, you know, political parties change over time. Democrats years ago were very conservative. Republicans were considered very liberal back in the 1800s. Political parties change over time, and the Republican Party has been changing, as has the Democratic Party.
Yes.
So in the midst of this change, how should the Republican Party be changing in a way that is more, let's say, embracing to Hispanics and other minorities?
I'm really glad you asked that, Dr. Matthews, because I want to touch on this point. I think it's the most important point of our discussion today. And I'm going to start with a poll done by the Dallas Morning News like 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. This was wrapped up September 14th. It says here, this is a poll of Texas Hispanic voters. So we're talking in the state of Texas. I know we have listeners nationwide. Listen to this. 35% of Texas Hispanic voters approved of Joe Biden's job as president. 54% disapproved. Mm-hmm. And again, my thesis is that people are realizing the consequences of a Biden Democratic governance. Now, as to what the Republican Party should do in the future, I have to tell you, I've been a political activist since 2008. I've been involved. I decided I needed to be involved and do things to change outcomes. And it seems like every 2 years, every new election cycle, I've helped many campaigns. I've helped the party locally, statewide. And every 2 years, we Hispanic conservatives have to retrain our mainstream white Republican allies. So here's what I have to say, that Hispanic voter engagement, Hispanic voter outreach, that flipping Hispanic voters from blue to red should not be left up to us Hispanic Republicans, Hispanic conservatives, that we need white allies. We need the leaders, those with influence, the donors, the advocates, and the activists of the Republican Party broadly to also consider that they need to be a part of this. We need you and people who look like you. This cannot be left up just to us. All right?
Adrienne, do you have some thoughts on that? Oh,
Did we lose her?
Well, I think we lost her. So maybe she'll be back here in just a second, but we've lost her. She was on a cell phone, so sometimes those connections fail. So why is it the case that the party has not reached out, and generally the people who run the party and whites, because I've heard this from minorities at times past. They said, I'm interested in being the party, but I can't seem to get a lot of support from the party. And they'll say, well, that's because, we don't think you're not just, it's going to be good money thrown after bad, because we're not going to have any success with you. But in fact, they are having success.
I think that's historical. I mean, there were certainly times, and again, all politics is local, right? It depends on your state, your county, your precinct, your district. Depends on all of these things. But sure, it was pretty safe to say, well, those people, they're going to just vote Democratic. But it's changing, and it's changing because of efforts like Adrienne's and people like the organizations I'm a part of.
Are you back with us, Adrienne?
I am. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
That's fine. So Edward talked a bit about how the Republican Party needs to change, and of course, the point I was trying to make was that political parties change over time. They sometimes change for the better, sometimes for the worse, and both the Republican and the Democratic parties are in change right now. Certainly, with the Democrats, you see them just moving dramatically left. So, what would you suggest that needs to happen within the Republican Party to make it more amenable and workable for Hispanics and other minorities?
Well, it's all I can speak about is what I'm familiar with. And right now we're preparing for our grand opening tomorrow. We're moving locations from 1,000 square feet to 4,000 square feet. That's a huge plus for us. And so collaboration is very, very important. But our committees, as far as the GOP chair is concerned and the county GOPs, we need to include more Hispanics. Hispanics, sometimes we want to stay in a bubble. But we got to go out there and we got to get involved. We got to fight for this country because if we don't, who will? And so, we do have an outreach committee. Alma Perez is our chair there. We do have a PR committee. Samantha Salazar is there. We do have a vacancy committee. Melissa Nur is there. So we have a diverse team, a strike force team, people that are going to be block walking and making phone calls. Hispanic community Texans need to be a part of this. And sometimes we'll say, well, Hispanics aren't here. Why aren't they here? Or how come they're not being hired? Or how come they're not? You got to go knock on the door, and if no one answers, you got to kick it down. And you got to establish a level of trust and let them know that your efforts are sincere and you're trying to do the right thing. And I think sometimes it takes a while, but the effort's worth it. And our country, our state, our communities, they're worth fighting for.
And Edward, as I mentioned, it's not just the Hispanic community. I mean, Nikki Haley, here you have an Asian American who from India, I think, who was governor of South Carolina. She could end up being a presidential candidate.
She could.
We have the Hispanic population with Ted Cruz and others. And it's a sort of a growing movement as minorities that have typically been more Democratic seem to be moving or drifting to Republicans a little more.
And it's because, the bottom line is we as conservatives, we know that conservative values, conservative principles and policies are good for families. They're good for the economy. They're good for the community. They're good for economic growth. These things help make healthy communities.
And it's interesting that you say this because the Democrats seem to be focused on identity politics, where what we should be talking about is how do you grow the economy? How do you make sure people have good jobs? How do you make sure that people are able to get good wages
how do you
out
help
there?
Families?
How do you help families? And I would argue lower taxes tend to do that, less regulation,
absolutely,
light touch government, and also an openness to people who are able to come in who don't look like us, but are able to but want to make a contribution to that kind of society.
I want to say one thing to the listeners. You know people that are not white, that are Americans. Talk to them. Everyone listening has contact with people. Ask them, what values they believe in, and advocate for conservative values. Mm-hmm. Challenge people.
Adrienne, I want to thank you for joining us today. Tell us how people can reach out to you and find out more about what's going on in Hidalgo County and in the GOP leadership down there.
Sure. You can volunteer. You can donate. You can see what's going on with our calendar of events at www.hidalgocountygop.us.
And we have links to that on our website. So if you want to go there, if our listeners want to go there, we encourage you to do so. And thank you so much for joining us, Adrienne.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Adrienne.
Boy, what a rock star she's become in the
she has.
In the movement there, because it was such a shock for people to find out that some of those counties down there, heavily Hispanic, heavily Democratic, ended up voting for Donald Trump. It was a sort of a shakeup, but I don't know that Democrats are being shaken up by that.
Well, they have their theories, and a lot of these things are just narratives. It's politics, so it's more about sound bites and narratives than facts and truth, unfortunately.
Well, Edward, Retta, thank you so much for joining me. We've done this. We did this, I think, some months ago, and then I suspect we'll be doing it again sometime because of the changes that are going on. And I want you to stay with us because when we come back, we're going to Dan Pilla to talk about tax issues. There are lots. I've seen the issue that there was something like 40 new taxes in President Biden's Build Back Better plan. He's going to say it's not going to tax anybody with incomes below $400,000. That is not true. If you're listening to this call, you're going to get a hit by the tax with that. So stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View for our next hour with Dan Pilla in just a few minutes.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And in this hour, we are going to be talking about taxes, because what's happening in Washington is Democrats are trying to figure out how they want to pay for their $3.5 trillion spending spree. And they've got all kinds of proposals out there. I've seen an estimate that there's something like 40 new taxes in there. But this is a work in progress, because Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kyrsten Sinema say they don't want to spend a full $3.5 trillion. They're comfortable with the $1.5 trillion. But some of this is going to take tax revenue, and it's going to the Democrats are looking for ways to bring that money in. So when we talk about taxes, we always go to our good friend Dan Pilla, who has been a frequent appearer on here on Point of View for more than 3 decades. He's been around as long as I have, and he knows everything taxes. You ought to be able to check him out on his website. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Merrill. How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing well. We're getting a little bit of static, but maybe that'll slip away here in just a minute. There's so much to talk about, the tax proposals out there. We don't know what's going to be in there yet, because the Democrats haven't decided what they're going to try to pass yet, but we have an idea of some of the things they want to do. Now, you did a piece just recently in National Review about what they have in there. The Biden's tax plan calls for indiscriminate spying. Now, tell us what that's all about.
Yeah, Merrill. First of all, let me say this. The Democrats don't care about paying for their spending program. This debate about whether it's going to be a tax increase of X dollars or Y dollars is all about taxes for the sake of taxes, Merrill. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with paying for the program. And so, what we're dealing with here is the full exposure, in my opinion, of what I call tax theologians. And these are people that believe in taxes as a matter of religious principle. They're not proposing these tax increases because they want or need the money. They're proposing these tax increases, Merrill, specifically to destroy capital in the hands of private parties. That's what it's all about, the destruction of capital in the hands of private people. It's no more or less than that, in my opinion. Now, in answer to your question, the systematic spying, this is a proposal in the Biden tax plan to require banks and financial institutions, not just banks, but we're talking about mortgage companies, savings and loans, any type of financial organization, investment companies, 401k, IRA companies, all of these companies that manage financial accounts on behalf of individuals, to require that organization to make a report to the federal government every single year, Merrill, if the net transactions in and out of that account are more than $600 per year. So imagine who would not be included in that dragnet when we're talking about a net of $600 a year or more. And so in that situation, the government would, the banks, the financial institutions would report to the government the history of the transactions, the in and out transactions in these bank accounts. So we're talking about a massive amount of data that they propose to force these banks to send to the federal government every single year.
Dan, this is mind-blowing because there is so much of that. I mean, the Democrats have stepped up and said, well, what, us try to monitor what you're doing, us try to monitor your finances and so forth. But this is a major step, and they're claiming they're trying to make sure, as I understand, to see any money laundering going on out there, people hiding income or something like that, because Biden thinks there's a lot of hidden tax money out there that's not coming in. But this would be one of the biggest intrusions of the federal government into your private affairs that we've ever seen, it seems like.
Yeah, there's no question about it, Merrill. And you put your finger on the fallacy of the Biden administration. The Treasury Department tells us that this is all about finding rich people, high-income people who pay no taxes or don't pay the taxes they are supposed to pay because they're hiding their income. And in fact, there was an article that was released on the Treasury Department's website here about 2 weeks ago that specifically talked about this proposal in the context of, quote-unquote, catching these high-income people. Now, I want you to keep this in context here, all right? So let's put this little argument to the test of reason and common sense. They tell us, the Treasury Department tells us, that the richest 1% of Americans are responsible for about 1/3 of the tax gap. That is to say, the amount of money that's owed to the IRS but not paid in. The richest 1%, Merrill, are people making about $275,000 a year or more. And yet the reporting requirement targets anybody with net transactions of more than $600.
Yeah,
so you tell me how that rich thing makes any sense.
I mean, if they said if people who were running checks through at $250,000 a time, then I could sort of see that. But it just doesn't make any sense that you would go down to $600. That's
it's absurd. And what it does is it captures every single American in the dragnet, because we're talking about net transactions here. We're not talking about one transaction of more than $600. If you've got a total over the course of the year, net in and out transactions of more than $600, then the report is required. But now, Merrill, let's talk about the merits of the reporting in the first place. They say, well, we got to have this reporting to catch the rich. And let's just use your example. Let's say they were targeting only, let's say, $250,000 of transactions. Mm-hmm. Even that's invasive and unnecessary, and I'll tell you why. If an individual comes under audit, Merrill, then the IRS has the authority under the Internal Revenue Code to issue a summons against their bank account, their financial institution, credit card company, mortgage company, I don't care who it is. They can issue a summons against that organization and get all of the specific bank records for that specific person for that specific tax period. They don't need this broad, overarching dragnet to drag every bit of financial information into the Treasury's clutches. They have the authority with the summons power under the law right now to get anything they need when they think they need it. And I'll tell you something else, Merrill. They don't need a warrant to get it. All right, so it's just absolutely disingenuous for these people to argue that they need this information on an ongoing basis in order to catch people not paying their taxes. They already have the tools they need to do it.
And you have to kind of wonder, what are they going to do with all this information? Where are they going to store it, and who's going to have access to it? We already know, remember from Lois Lerner back when there were groups, 501c4s or C6s, I think, who were applying for tax-exempt status, and we found out that was being fudged by the IRS. And then it seems like every now and then we hear about the Chinese or the Russians who are able to hack into the government systems to get data out of there, and they're doing a better job of that both in the public sector and the private sector. So how are you make all this information available, and it's mind-boggling. My guest for this hour, Dan Pilla. He is the tax expert extraordinaire. We're going to be talking to him in this hour about the various tax proposals that are in Biden's Build Back Better legislation and what he wants to do with that. We want to see what the key tax issues here, and my big concern is this new global tax Dan and I have talked about this a few times over the past several months. The global tax that several countries, over 100 countries, have sort of agreed upon. It would be the first time we sort of agreed with other countries to have a minimum tax out there. So stay with us. We'll be back with Dan Pilla in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Karine Hajar asked an important question. Do universities still care about truth? I suspect you already know the answer, but her commentary surfaced some interesting facts. She is a recent graduate of Harvard and even served on the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson. Although universities say they value diversity, intellectual diversity is not something they seem to value. She reminds us that only 3% of Harvard University's faculty reported being conservative. Organizations that work on college campuses have found that most faculty and students are self-censoring themselves on campus. They have seen what happens to anyone who strays from leftist orthodoxy. College and cancel culture, she says, has become disturbingly synonymous. To illustrate her point, she tells the story of Professor Steven Pinker. In previous commentaries, I've talked about some of his books, including Enlightenment Now. He has persuasively argued that the world isn't getting worse, but improving in significant ways. Apparently, that's what got him in trouble. Hundreds of members of the Linguistic Society of America have signed a petition to remove him from the organization. The complaint comes from an African-American social scientist who believes that reporting that overt racism is decreasing is legitimate grounds for punishment. Now, Pinker is a big enough name to weather the latest political storm. Of course, he also has tenure. But other educators and students are not as fortunate. As one attorney put it, if you have to be Steven Pinker to avoid being canceled, that's a problem. This latest example illustrates what happens to a secular progressive Ivy League professor. Other faculty members and students really don't stand much of a chance. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby today, and on the phone with me is Dan Pilla, a tax expert extraordinaire, longtime friend who's appeared on Point of View now for more than 3 decades. So, Dan, we were talking about your National Review piece, Biden's tax plan calls for indiscriminate spying, and I'd encourage our listeners to go and take a look at that because it's very informative. But I also want to talk about this new global tax. Now, when Janet Yellen and President Biden started suggesting that they might want to have a global minimum tax out there, I sort of dismissed it a little bit, thinking, you're going to be able to get all these countries on, especially Ireland, which has one of the lowest tax rates, I think a 12.5% corporate tax rate, and I didn't think Ireland would jump on this. I heard last week, I believe, that Ireland is going along with it. So I think there's more than 100 countries who've entered this agreement. That doesn't make it law in the U.S., but tell us about what this global minimum tax is trying to do.
Well, yeah, Merrill, what it's trying to do basically is eliminate any tax haven countries that would otherwise draw corporations or international businesses into some kind of a base in that country because of its lower rate. Let's say, for example, the United States has a corporate tax rate. By the time the Biden administration is done, it'll be about 26%. As opposed to the 20% that it is right now. So let's just use the number 26%. Let's say U.S. corporate tax rate's 26%, and we've got countries like Ireland is a good example because they've long been a haven, a draw for corporate businesses because of their low corporate rate. So let's just say their rate's 15%. Well, that is a pretty significant incentive for companies to base themselves in Ireland and do business in Ireland as much as they can because of that lower rate. Whereas if we have a global tax rate, whereas all these, let's just say these Western countries, these industrial nations agree that, our global tax rate is going to be, pick a number, 23%. Now what you've done is you've eliminated the international competition for businesses to go from country A to country B because they're going to get a better rate in country B. That's what this is all about. It's not a situation, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. It's not a situation where U.S.-based companies that do business exclusively in the United States are now going to have to pay a quote-unquote global tax. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here, as I said, is leveling the playing field as far as tax rates among these various nations. And what's happening is the United States Department of State and the Department of Treasury is putting all kinds of pressure on these countries, Merrill, to raise their rates to dissuade U.S. companies from fleeing our shores. Now, you and I would answer that question much differently. We would say to each other, well, why not just lower the American corporate tax rate and make America the most competitive tax country in the world? Why don't we make the United States a tax haven nation? And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. When the corporate tax rate was cut from 35% down to 20%, all of the corporations that were fleeing America did a 180, Merrill, and they came back.
That's right.
And what they brought back with them was billions of dollars of capital that was socked away in banks offshore, and they brought back with them tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs and construction projects for infrastructure and facilities and so on. And the Biden administration is going to reverse that policy, which to me is just fundamentally disastrous.
It's a very good point, because once the tax bill passed in 2017, the Trump tax cut, and you had that corporate tax rate. We had, back in the 80s, we had roughly the same as most of Europe. It was up there around, 35-40% or something like that. But all of Europe began dropping their corporate tax rates. And so it went down to about a 21% average among European countries. And so the Trump tax bill cut ours down to make it roughly equivalent to what was happening in Europe and made us competitive again. And once you did that, companies said, well, there's no point in us being in this. We'd rather be in the U.S. under their laws and their customs and their law enforcement and other things. So we'll move our shops back to the U.S. And that was a huge boon for the economy.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, there was, and I was writing about this a great deal, and I know you were too. There were literally hundreds of thousands of jobs that were created in about a 2-year period of time when there was two things that happened. Number one was the reduction in the rates, as you said, back down to 21%. And then secondly, there was relief granted to these organizations, to these corporations, to bring capital back into the United States, bring their cash back into the U.S. And so the repatriation rules were changed, and the sting was taken out of a lot of the penalties for bringing this money back. And so corporations had an incentive to bring back their resources. And Merrill, they brought back billions of dollars. Billions of dollars came back, and that money was spent in the U.S. economy. This idea that corporations are just going to sit on the money and they're going to hoard it is just simply not true. Tens of billions of dollars, billions of dollars was spent on infrastructure, on hiring new employees, on tools and equipment, on inventory. It's all kinds of things they spent this money on. Why? Because businesses want to be competitive in the marketplace, Merrill. That's why. And their ability to make these investments made them more competitive.
And there was a term we heard a lot during the Obama administration called corporate inversions, and that's where a company that was based here in the U.S. would, in essence, just say, we're going under this, we're moving our corporate headquarters to Ireland. Nothing may really change. Maybe some paperwork changed, maybe they put a couple of desks over there, but it was a corporate inversion. That was so you got under the other countries' tax regime, because all these businesses, global businesses, are in global competition. So if you've got Ireland and they've got a much lower tax rate than our corporate rate, then companies that are based there are able to charge less and be more competitive than we can, because we've got to pay such high taxes. And once the tax bill passed, that issue of corporate inversions has largely gone away. We haven't heard that for a while.
Yeah, we haven't heard that for a while, and you put your finger right on it. The inversions were caused by the imbalance in the tax rates, and the solution to the problem is to lower our rate, not raise it to match all the rest of the other countries in the world. We should have the lowest corporate tax rate in the world, and you know what that tax rate should be? I know you know. It should be 0%. Corporations should not pay a nickel's worth of income taxes, Merrill, because corporations don't pay taxes. People do. When you put tax burdens on corporations, what happens is the corporations never pay the tax, but people do in one of three ways. The people pay the tax in the form of increased costs for products and services, so the customers pay the tax, or the owners of the corporation pay the tax, that is to say the shareholders, in terms of reduced return on their investment, or the employees pay the tax in the form of fewer employees or fewer wages and benefits on the employees that are already in the corporation. So either the owners pay it, the employees pay it, or the customers pay it, but the corporation never pays it. And so this is the fallacy we've got to understand if we're going to straighten out our corporate tax policy here in America. Corporations don't pay taxes, people do.
And it was interesting because Barack Obama, as president, was so upset with these inversions that were going on, he decided to create a penalty, if I remember correctly, because he's a penalizing kind of guy. Rather than using carrots, he liked to use sticks, because he wanted to try to stop these companies from doing the corporate inversion. And he claimed he didn't understand what was going on there. Well, it was the tax system. It's your high taxes that are forcing that to happen.
Yeah, there's no question about it. Listen, taxes influence behavior, Merrill, and we as ordinary Americans need to wrap our heads around this idea. Taxes influence behavior. Let me ask you this question. If there was a tax rate of 100% on every dollar of income you earned over $50,000, how much would you work to earn income over $50,000?
I wouldn't.
And nobody would. Nobody with any sense would spend a nickel, or would spend a minute, I should say, working to earn more than a nickel over $50,000 if the government was going to take every penny of it. Taxes influence behavior. This is true with individuals. It's true with corporations. It's true with any tax policy. And so if we want to build an economy that's solid and functional, we've got to stop taxing production, because what you tax, you get less of.
So, Dan, when we come back, I'd like to talk about, there's individual tax increases in here, and there's corporate tax increases that they're looking at imposing upon the country if they pass this legislation. So I'd like to get your take on sort of the most egregious of these, and I assume those are probably going to be the ones that are the most likely to pass. Because we know they're thinking. My guest for this hour is Dan Pilla. We're talking about taxes in the Build Back Better program. If you want to find out more about Dan Pilla, we have information about him on the Point of View website. So I'd encourage you to go to pointofview.net. You can find out that. He has a newsletter that you can get and other things. And if you have tax problems, you can always reach out to him, because he is the man to go to for companies and individuals who have tax problems. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a few minutes to talk about these tax increases that Democrats are wanting to put on all of us, and why this notion of not going to tax more than $400,000 is just a nonsense.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And with me on the phone is Dan Pilla, tax expert we go to discuss, especially in this case, all the proposed taxes that are being considered in Biden's Build Back Better legislation. So, Dan, we were talking about the corporate taxes. There's also individual tax increases. And, of course, what I'm looking at right now is an assessment from Bloomberg News, a list of tax increases in the House Ways and Means Committee proposal. That's the chief tax writing entity in the House. And I'm looking at that because all of this is still in flux. We don't know what's actually they're going to propose to try to pass. But one of the proposals for the corporations is to raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 26.5%. That's the House Ways and Means. My understanding is Joe Biden had been wanting to go up to 28%. I think others were suggesting they go back to the original tax rate, which was, what was it, 36.5%, something like that?
Yeah, it was 35%, Merrill, was the top corporate tax rate. And some of the most leftist Democrats during the campaign were talking about doing exactly that.
Yeah.
And I think Biden would do that, too, if he thought for a minute he could get away with it. But, it's bad enough going back to 26.5% from the 21 that we have now. And the idea of going back to 35%, there's just only the most radical left, if they control the radical left now, if they control the House and the Senate, would get that done.
It's interesting because Joe Biden has got a struggling economy right now. In some ways it's going well, in a lot of ways it's struggling. But if you want to be able to go and run for re-election on a strong economy, you need a low tax rate, and that's not what he's doing. And of course, they never once they pass the higher taxes and it begins to affect the economy, they never take credit for that or take the blame, let's say. They just simply say, well, that's just, they cast it off on other issues. But I also understand they're looking at maybe trying to tax cryptocurrencies and other things. What's going on with cryptocurrencies now? Are they taxable? How does that work?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, Merrill, because there's a lot of confusion out there about cryptocurrencies. The IRS's position right now, and has been for some years, they've got published opinion pieces on this, Merrill, that have taken the form of what we call revenue rulings. And a revenue ruling is binding on the IRS and binding on citizens. It's not a law per se, but it is the IRS's official position as to what the law is in a particular case and how they're going to enforce the law in a particular case. These revenue rulings have been on the books with respect to crypto for quite a while. And they take the position that crypto is taxed just like any other capital asset. So, for example, let's say you own one share of the stock in the ABC Corporation. You buy the stock for $10, Merrill, and you sell it for $11. In that situation, you've got a capital gain of $1, and that dollar gain is taxed depending on how long you held the stock, either as a short-term or long-term capital gain, all right? So that share of stock is taxed as a capital gain. This is true of real estate. It's true of any hard asset, all right? So now let's take the same share of stock, the ABC stock. You've got one share of the ABC company. You bought it for $10, and now you sell it for $9. In that situation, you've got a capital loss. And again, depending on how long you held the asset, it's either short-term or long-term. Crypto is treated exactly the same way as any other capital asset. You buy crypto for $10 and sell it for $30, you've got a $20 capital gain on that transaction, and the IRS wants it reported and they want the tax paid on it. Now, people seem to believe, Merrill, and I'm still hearing this even years after the IRS has published these legal opinions in their revenue rulings. People believe that crypto transactions are not taxed, and it's not true. It's just never been true that they aren't taxed. And so what the Biden administration is proposing is to put specific laws on the books that specifically point to the taxability of crypto. There aren't any such laws on the books right now, but that doesn't mean crypto is not a capital asset. It is, Merrill. Mm-hmm. If you buy a collector's volume book, for example, a first edition book of the Alice in Wonderland, just to pull something out of the air.
Right.
And you buy that for $10,000 and sell it for $20,000, well, guess what? You got a capital gain on that transaction, and it's taxable. This is no different with crypto.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what affects individuals now. And let's go to the SALT tax, because the SALT tax, the state and local tax, in the 2017 legislation, Republicans put a cap on the state and local tax deduction that people can take of $10,000. And that got people, wealthier people, but especially in high tax blue states, screaming that they were not able to take the full deduction of their inflated properties. And so
the irony, Merrill, the irony of this is so magnificent, I can't stop laughing.
And so they've been pushing, and there are several members of Congress I've read, Democrats, who their key issue is eliminating the SALT tax because it taxed higher income people, and that was something that came from Republicans, and they want to say Republicans always give tax breaks to higher income people, and Democrats always help lower income people, but that's not the case with the SALT tax.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? The Democrats were screaming for years that Trump's tax law, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was nothing more than tax cuts for the rich. That statement, Merrill, was demonstrably false. All right, demonstrably false. The people that benefited the most from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were the people right in the heart of the middle class, making between about 35 to 85, 90 grand a year. They got the most benefit from the cuts under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. One of the groups of people, top 20% of income earners, either had no change in their tax liability or saw an increased tax. And one of the reasons the top 20% saw an increase in their tax liability was because of what you just talked about, the cap on state and local taxes. All right, now it's capped at $10,000. So folks that are in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, some of these high tax states, California, Minnesota, where I live, they're having their tax deductions limited. And these tax deductions are for taxes paid to states that now they can't write off, so that means their taxes went up. Now, here's the thing. Biden has been screaming about taking out this SALT limitation and putting it back to the way it was, no limit on state and local taxes. But it is also demonstrably true that the only people who are going to benefit from this, Merrill, are the top 20% of income earners. So in the truest sense of the phrase, this is tax cuts for the rich. And the people that are championing it are the leftist Democrats. They're the ones who want to put it back in tax cuts for the rich. And the reason for this, Merrill, is that rich people are voting with their feet when it comes to these high tax jurisdictions. People are fleeing New York and California and Minnesota and some of these other high tax jurisdictions, and they're running for their financial lives to lower tax jurisdictions so they don't get pounded by this SALT limitation and other things as well. I remember. Go ahead.
I was going to say, let's take just a second to talk about another falsehood of Joe Biden's, which is nobody making under $400,000 a year will see any tax increase. And a colleague of mine at the Institute for Policy Innovation, Tom Giovanetti, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think about a week or 10 days ago, looking at the increased tobacco tax that they were proposing. I think it was going to be like $1 a pack or something like that. But Tom pointed out that lower income people tend to a disproportionate share of them tend to smoke, use tobacco products, and so if you're increasing taxes on tobacco, you are disproportionately hitting low-income people and people who are making a lot less than $400,000 a year.
Yeah, and Tom is exactly right, and it's not just the tobacco tax. I mean, you can say, well, how many people are really smoking anymore? Maybe it's not that big a deal, even though it is disproportionately loaded on low-income people. But let's just set that aside, for example, for a second. What about the tax increases on oil and gas, Merrill? Most of the oil and gas production and exploration tax breaks that are in the code are going to be taken out, and increased taxes are going to be imposed on gasoline, significant tax increases that we haven't seen in probably about a decade at the federal level. Tell me who doesn't use gasoline, Merrill. Tell me what product in the United States is not affected by higher gas prices. Everybody is going to see increased costs of products across the board, and it's going to cost more money to fill up their car, not just because of inflation and what we're seeing now, but because of increased federal gas tax prices. And everybody is going to suffer because of that, Merrill, particularly low-income people.
And one of the ironies there is that as gas prices have been going up, President Biden has been trying to encourage Saudi Arabia and OPEC to pump more gas so that you'll increase supply and the prices might go down, because he knows people vote when gas prices go up. Stay with us. We have one more segment with Dan Pilla. We'll be back with him in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with Dan Pilla, talking about the tax increases that the Democrats want to put to pay for their $3.5 trillion Build Back Better program. Dan, they are looking at raising the individual income tax. We talked about corporate taxes, but now they're looking at raising the individual income tax. In the House Ways and Means Committee, they wanted to raise it back to where it was before President Trump, and that was, I think, 39.6% for the individual income, the top rate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. 39.6, so it'd go up 2.6 points from where the top rate is right now. And the other thing, Merrill, is they want to add a 3% surtax to quote-unquote high-income people. And, of course, what constitutes a high-income person? That depends on who you ask, right? But the provision in the bill right now is for anybody making $5 million a year or more, this would be adjusted gross income. There'd be a 3% surtax, so the tax liability would go to 42.6%. And here's my reaction to this, Merrill, and this gets back to what I said at the top of the program, and that is this. These proposals have no economic substance to them whatsoever. These proposals are based on tax theology. And what I mean by tax theology is these are people who believe in taxes as a religious principle for the purposes of separating the wealth that people have earned legally and peacefully, separating them from that wealth and having the government confiscate it. That's all it's about. There is no economic significance whatsoever. There's certainly no constitutional validity in the idea of a 3% excise tax or surtax on people making high dollars. Where does it say that, Merrill, that we have the right to use tactics of invidious discrimination on high-income people just because they're high-income people? Merrill, we would never tolerate that when we're talking about race relations or the relations between the genders or any other area of law. We would never tolerate that kind of discrimination, and yet we embrace it and welcome it when it comes to tax policy.
It's interesting because we were talking about the capital gains tax a few minutes ago. And of course, one could make the case that in the past, not many people, half the public or something had IRAs that were invested in various funds, and there might be the IRAs are not taxed anyway, but there's capital gains taxes, and that didn't really affect that many people. But interestingly, during the pandemic, and especially with the money the government was handing out, we've seen Robinhood, the new website for people to be able to go and invest in the stock market. Webull is another one out there. Several people have gone, and it's not big money. They're taking, in many cases, just a small amount of money, and they've begun to invest this, and they could get capital gains if tax increase, the capital gains from that if they keep it in there long enough, and if they get to qualify for the capital gains tax. So a lot more people are involved in that these days than might have been 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, you're exactly right, Merrill, and this points out an additional fallacy of only people making $400,000 a year are going to pay more taxes. This capital gains rate is going to go from 20 to 25%. And I'll tell you, Merrill, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with you on this. I believe that the vast majority of Americans have an interest in the capital gains tax, no matter what their level of income is, because the vast majority of Americans have some kind of pension or retirement plan, IRA, 401k. If you've got so much as $10 invested in a company pension, I don't care what kind of a pension it is, or your own savings account of some kind, you have an interest in capital gains rates being low. And even though the individual doesn't pay taxes on his IRA account, Merrill, until he takes the money out, the institution sure as heck pays taxes on the trades, and those high taxes reduce your return on investment. There's no question about it.
And speaking of taxes on capital gains, a lot of people own their houses. They have houses. They've been paying. They've got a mortgage on it, but they've seen the value of that house skyrocket here over the past year or two. If they're selling the house and they're getting a lot more than they actually paid for it, what's the tax provision there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's causing confusion for a lot of folks. Right now, Merrill, you are not taxed. An individual is not taxed on the capital gain on their house within certain limits. If you're an individual, then you can exclude up to $250,000 of capital gain from taxation, as long as you owned it for 5 years and lived there for at least 2 before you sell it. If you're married filing jointly, then you can exclude up to $500,000. Now, that's great news, but the problem is when we're seeing these artificial inflationary gains in real estate that we've seen for the last 18 months, that's going to be that exemption is going to be, or I should say, those gains are going to be eaten into because the exemption is capped at $250,000 or $500,000.
Okay, I think the wealth tax, Senator Warren's wealth tax, is probably off the table for right now, but maybe not for long. Take just a minute to talk about what the wealth tax was and what it would do.
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders both were very hot for their wealth tax, and this was for lack of a better way to explain it, Merrill, it's an estate tax imposed by a government that doesn't have the patience to wait till you're dead. All right, it's an estate tax that's imposed every single year based on the value of assets that you owned. It's not an income tax. It's not a capital gains tax. It's a tax on the total value of the wealth itself. Distinguish it this way, Merrill. The income tax is a tax on the fruit that's produced by the tree. It doesn't attack the tree. All right, capital gains is a tax on the fruit produced by the tree. It doesn't attack the tree. A wealth tax cuts a branch off the tree every single year. That's what it does. It's an attack on the tree that produced the income or the wealth, not just the wealth itself. And so it's in my opinion, Merrill, it's the quintessential example of outright government theft. And again, it gets back to what I've been saying throughout the course of the program. It's imposed by religious theologians, these people who support taxes for the sake of taxes as a matter of religious principle because they want to steal the money from people that they earned lawfully and peacefully and appropriate it to the government so that they can use it for whatever welfare program they can think of next.
You know, and my biggest concern is something could be very valuable. We watch the Antiques Roadshow every now and then, and antiques that were much more valuable in 1 year aren't so valuable anymore. And so you could be taxed a wealth tax on something that had skyrocketed at one point and then down to almost nothing, and a few years later.
Oh yeah, and that's a problem, no question about it. But think, Merrill, about the value of an operating business going up and down every single year.
Yeah.
Depending on what kind of business you have, and depending on how the economy is shaping up for your particular market segment. I mean, this is a massively complicated compliance problem. And the good news, you're right, is it's off the table. The bad news is for how long. Listen, Merrill, these people never give up. They never give up.
I agree with that. There's nothing truer than that. Tell us, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, you've got a book out on small business and so tax issues. Tell us how to get in touch with you and what you've got available.
Yeah, absolutely. My book, Dan Pilla, Small Business Tax Guide, Merrill, is my brand new book. If you operate a small business in the United States of America, you simply have to have this book. It talks about the 12 or 15, 16, 17 most common problems that businesses have with the IRS, and I show you how to avoid every single one of them. So if you're an operating small business, sole proprietorship, partnership, S corporation, any of those types of businesses, you must simply have this book. There's no question about it. And the way to get it is you go to taxhelponline.com. That's all one word, taxhelponline.com. We've got all kinds of resources there, including my books and my newsletter, taxhelponline.com.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dan. We appreciate it, and we'll be back in touch sometime soon because this tax issue isn't over.
That's for sure.
And my thanks to Doug in there, sitting in the engineer's chair, and to Steve, sitting in the producer's chair, for handling the buttons today. So thank you for joining us, and Point of View will be back tomorrow.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.